everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Tyler, and the focus is explosion, marriage, and Texas. The year is 1842, it's August, and Tyler and his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, have just put the finishing touches on a nice treaty with Great Britain, the Webster-Ashburton deal, and it was time then to look a little bit more inward to his personal life, and the happenings in the White House was a joyous moment in that very month for the wedding of Elizabeth Tyler to William Waller. There was a special guest at this event, and it was actually a family member who most had not seen. Letitia Tyler, John Tyler's wife, the First Lady of the United States, had spent the first couple of years of his administration basically isolated in her bedroom. She had suffered a paralytic stroke just before Tyler became president, so she was with him, but rarely seen in the White House, and she was able to come downstairs and enjoy the wedding of her daughter Elizabeth. But it would be one of her last memories because just a couple of weeks later, Letitia Tyler died. We fast forward about a year and a half. It's February 28, 1844, and President Tyler is actually going on a cruise on the USS Princeton on the Potomac River, and he's got some cabinet members with him and about 400 passengers, and they're celebrating a new weapon, the biggest, most powerful weapon in the United States Navy, and they called it the Peacemaker. And to great cheers, they fired that Peacemaker several times during this river cruise. Everyone very excited about this mark of military prowess for the United States. And when they got to Mount Vernon, it was time to turn around and head back to Washington, D.C. But the folks on board wanted one more blast of the Peacemaker as an homage to the first president of the United States and his home with George Washington in Mount Vernon. And originally the captain of the vessel, Robert Stockton, said, nope, we're done firing for tonight. But the Navy Secretary, Thomas Gilmer stepped in and overruled his captain and said, you know what? Let's give one more blast for George Washington. And sure enough, they did, and it was a different kind of blast. It was a disaster. The Peacemaker exploded right before them. 9 people were killed, including 2 cabinet secretaries. Secretary Gilmer died, and Secretary Abel Upshur also died. He was the Secretary of State, having recently taken over for Daniel Webster. John Tyler's body servant died in this tragic accident. Now, fortunately, the president was downstairs or down below deck when the explosion occurred. He was listening to some of the entertainment and also spending some time with a young woman by the name of Julia Gardner. She's only 24 years old. He's a little smitten, spending some time together. Well, that would accelerate because Gardner's father was among the 9 who were killed when the Peacemaker exploded. David Gardner passed away. The event, all of these sort of things happening at the same time, and Tyler and Julia Gardner got closer together rather quickly. 4 months later, they were getting married. It took place at the Church of the Ascension in New York, which was Julia Gardner's hometown, and she became First Lady of the United States. Again, he was twice her age, but that didn't seem to matter to either of them. In fact, Julia Gardner, now Tyler, reflected on the first time she had met her husband. She said, when I look back on this day and see him as he stood in the green room in the White House, it appears to me no marvel, acquainted as I am with his high-toned nature, that the wild frenzy of political misrepresentation left no impression of bitterness, either upon his countenance or his voice or demeanor. He welcomed us with an urbanity which made the deepest impression upon my father, and we could not help commenting as we left the room upon the silvery sweetness of his voice that seemed to in just attune with the incomparable grace of his bearing and the elegant ease of his conversation. One of the interesting things about Tyler, as objectionable as he was politically to so many people, he didn't seem to ever take offense. He didn't hold grudges, and he sort of just let that roll off his back, unlike many of his thin-skinned predecessors who took most of these criticisms far too seriously at times. But for Tyler, that wasn't his demeanor. He was that consummate Southern gentleman, and he tended to look beyond the acrimony of the moment. This perhaps was one of the things that attracted the young Julia Gardner to become his bride. Tyler himself was ecstatic about the new entrant into his life, writing to one of his daughters that she is all that I could wish her to be, the the most beautiful woman of the age and at the same time the most accomplished. Things in the White House did change with Julia Tyler now as the First Lady. There were a lot more social events. She was very active in them. And in fact, she didn't shy away from political discourse. She would often engage with the men who would arrive at these functions and engage in political conversation. Well, there were political implications as well to that disaster on the Princeton when the Peacemaker exploded. Again, Abel Upshur, the new Secretary of State, a critical member of the Tyler cabinet, in part because he was running point on the most important part of the Tyler agenda, and that was the acquisition of Texas. Texas had become an independent republic in 1836 when Andrew Jackson was still president of the United States. And there was talk at that time about annexing Texas into the American Union, which President Jackson was all for, but he didn't have time. He wasn't able to pull it off. And when Martin Van Buren became president, he was aligned with Jackson on almost everything except Texas. Van Buren broke with Jackson on the concept of Texas because he felt, based on his read, that Mexico still believed that Texas was part of Mexico. It had not fully let Texas go, despite an agreement that was signed. According to the Mexicans, that was signed under duress, and they believed that Texas was still theirs and potentially in a state of war. And if the United States tried to acquire Texas, Martin Van Buren was convinced it would mean war with Mexico, and he was unwilling to do that. Well, his administration passed away or ended, and then William Henry Harrison came in. He died. Now it's John Tyler, and Tyler was all for bringing Mexico into the United States. Very early in his administration, he told his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, that it seems to me that the great interests of the North would be incalculably advanced by such an acquisition. How deeply interested is the shipping interest? Slavery. I know that is the objection, and would be well-founded if it did not already exist among us. But my belief is that a rigid enforcement of the laws against the slave trade would in time make as many free states south as the acquisition of Texas would add of slave states. And then the future, distant it might be, would present wonderful results. Well, many in the North did not agree with this position, and slavery was at the center of it. And there were vocal discussions in Congress and in the overall public discourse against the acquisition of Texas because many Northerners in particular were against the expansion of slavery. Now, Tyler didn't pursue an annexation of Texas in his first couple of years in office, in part because Daniel Webster was against it. But once Webster resigned, this became his most important element of his agenda. And Upshur had been leading those negotiations. And those negotiations weren't going all that quickly, which was frustrating to Sam Houston, who was the president of Texas. When Houston started to flirt with an alternative, potentially having some kind of an arrangement with Great Britain, Tyler further intensified his efforts. He wasn't going to allow that to happen for a variety of reasons, and he wanted Texas into the American Union. So while Upshur was pushing for this, it made a big change in the equation when he was suddenly killed. Tyler needed a new Secretary of State. He needed someone who would negotiate on his behalf and as quickly as possible. He found his man in former Vice President, former Senator John Calhoun of South Carolina, who accepted the position. And boy, did he get to work. Focusing exclusively on Texas, within 2 weeks, he had crafted an agreement that was signed by both parties, ready to submit to the United States Senate. This agreement had one really important element to it that the Texans insisted upon. They wanted a military guarantee that once the treaty was signed, that President Tyler would send the American army into Texas down near the Mexican border in case the Mexicans decided to take military action against Texas and try to prevent the annexation. They also insisted that the American Navy be put into the Gulf of Mexico for the very same reason. Now, this called into a constitutional question. Did John Tyler, as president, have the authority to make such a deployment? Congress has the authority over declaring war. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. A strict constructionist like Tyler, who really gave no wiggle room to his interpretation of the Constitution, probably had some questions about this, about whether or not he could do so without congressional authority. This is one case where he did go ahead, in part because he was so convinced that the treaty was going to be approved. He said that there exists no civilized government on earth having a voluntary tender made it of a domain so rich and fertile, so replete with all that can add to national greatness and wealth and so necessary to its peace and safety that would reject the offer. It was inconceivable to him that that's what happened, but that is what happened. There was a vocal minority, in both houses of Congress strongly against the acquisition of Texas, and it was enough to defeat the treaty in the Senate. A treaty requires 2/3 approval, and they didn't get to that level. So the question is, what was John Tyler going to do? He's running out of time. His administration is coming to an end, and he made a really interesting statement for John Tyler. He said in June of 1844, "The great question is not as to the manner in which it shall be done, but whether it shall be accomplished or not." This is the closest John Tyler ever said to "the ends justifies the means." Like, I'm going to figure out a way to do this no matter what. That was not the modus operandi of a John Tyler, but in this case, he was really pushing to figure out a way to bring Texas into the American Union, knowing that he didn't have a supermajority in the Senate to approve a treaty. Now, treaties had typically been used on the acquisition of territory into the United States, and even this had been a question going back to the purchase of the Louisiana Territory by Thomas Jefferson, John Tyler's political idol. Jefferson at the time thought that he didn't have authority in the Constitution to even make such an acquisition, even with congressional sanction in a 2/3 vote of a treaty. He thought that was unconstitutional and contemplated needing a constitutional amendment so that he could do so. Well, when Napoleon at the time started to backtrack and maybe I'm not going to give this sale to the United States, Jefferson put his constitutional concerns aside and went forward, and the United States did acquire the Louisiana Territory by a treaty that was confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. Well, Tyler came up with a different provision. He's very clever about using the Constitution, and he peeked in on Article 4, Section 3, which said that new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union. Now, all territories that had come in via acquisition to date in American history had come in as territories. None had come in directly as states. But Tyler saw this provision as a way to get around that. He didn't have to have a treaty to bring Texas into the United States as a territory. He could have them come in directly as a state by an act of both houses of Congress. He believed that this provision said if both the House and the Senate, by a majority vote only, not a supermajority in the Senate like you need for a treaty, that would be sufficient to legally and constitutionally bring Texas into the Union. And so that is what he decided to pursue. And in fact, it worked. Again, there was a lot of backlash against this. Unconstitutional, you're breaking the rules, you can't do it this way. But Tyler was convinced. He looked at Article 4, Section 3. There's really no caveat on the rules by which Congress can decide whether or not to bring in an entity into a new state, including, in this case, a foreign country, the independent Republic of Texas. If they had a majority vote in both houses, that was constitutional. Now, there are some additional elements of Article 4, Section 3 that are some limitations on this act, but that's only when you're trying to carve out a new state out of an existing state. That gets a little more complicated. But other than that, for this kind of transaction, Tyler very cleverly went to the Constitution and found the provision that worked. In fact, both houses did vote. Senate was really close, 27 to 25. The House was easier, but by that, 3 days before his term was going to expire, John Tyler signed the measure into law that would bring Texas into the Union. Now, there was still a little bit work left to be done under his successor, James Polk, because there were still some final negotiations, but this was the greatest accomplishment in John Tyler's mind in his presidency, and he is the one who gets most of the credit for bringing Texas into the American Union, and he did it just a couple of days before his term expired. That is John Tyler, An Explosion, Marriage, and Texas, from the life of John Tyler. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.